This is a video in a series of videos I'm making for a class I teach at ASU, PHI 328, History of Ancient Philosophy. And here we are at the syllabus. We've been thinking about Aristotle, so let's go down to the lecture notes. And here we are, go down to Aristotle. And we had a general introduction to Aristotle last time. Remember that we're understanding him as reacting to Plato. In particular, we're thinking about how he reacts to the picture of reality in Plato's Timaeus. In this dialogue, which seems to have been, which we think probably was written not longer after Aristotle entered the academy as a student, there's an explanation of living things in terms of forms, the receptacle, and the divine maker. Now we're understanding Aristotle is trying to remove problems he sees in this explanation. And he tells us and the part of it we're looking at today is the explanation of living things. We're not going to talk about the divine maker yet. What Aristotle does about that'll be subject for a future video. In book 2 of the physics, which the physics itself is the first of the physical works. Remember that the Aristotelian corpus is divided into logical, physical, and ethical works. In book 2, he tells us that natural substances are beings with a nature, with a physis. Remember, this is the word that gets that starts to become part of ancient philosophy with the inquirers into nature. And Aristotle tells us in book 2 of the physics that this nature of a natural substance is what he describes as a starting point of change and staying unchanged. Now this is a little, what he has in mind here is not transparent. We'll think about it, but first let's go to the passage here. And I think we should be able to get there. It's in the Loeb Classical Library, which unfortunately has a paywall, but because I'm affiliated with ASU, I get to use that library as part of a service ASU provides and should be also available to ASU students. And we can see where Aristotle says it. Let's see if I can find it. Yeah, I changed the translation a little bit, but what he says is that they have within themselves a principle of movement and change. This is his idea here that I've translated the way I have, a starting point of change and staying unchanged. Now, to begin to get an idea of what Aristotle's thinking, it helps, I think, to think about a passage we saw in the past in Plato's Protagoras, where Socrates is talking about whether pleasure can overcome knowledge. And after he gives his argument, he doesn't think it can. At least that's the position he's arguing for. And after he gets his interlocutors to agree, he makes the following remarks. He said that having this happen, having pleasure, overcome knowledge, it's not in human nature. Not in human nature. And here we have the Greek, which in this particular case, it's pretty easy to see the correspondence, right, in human nature. And Aristotle thinks that human beings, there are instances of natural substances. This is the kind of thing whose existence he's interested in. What a substance is will occupy us for quite a while. But at this point, he's we can, it's enough to know that he takes human beings to be an instance of a natural substance. So I get that right, an instance of a natural substance, and that he, like Socrates, is thinking that human beings have a nature. Their nature is human nature, and it somehow is the cause of human beings behaving in the specific ways they do, the ways they do that are common to the species. And what Aristotle is trying to figure out, what he's thinking about is how, what a nature is in the existence of a natural substance, so that it really can be this kind of cause, so that it can be a starting point of change and staying unchanged. And um, and maybe it helps a little, I think, to think about the prior tradition, um, the pre-Socratic tradition, after Parmenides eliminates natural bodies, excuse me. Right, we saw that when we looked at the pre-Socratic period, and Aristotle, he doesn't follow this tradition. He thinks that natural bodies are real. He follows instead the general line. He's going to disagree about details, but he follows the general line in the Timaeus that natural bodies exist in terms of forms. And what he disagrees about is how these forms exist. He does not think that the forms are separate, and we'll explain how Plato thinks about this, as Plato seems to. But Aristotle describes the forms of natural bodies as in matter and separate in account. So now we need to figure out what this means for him. And it helps to think a little bit about the ship of Theseus. This is a ship that was mentioned in the Phaedo. Remember that Socrates spent some time in jail before his execution. He was convicted, and then the penalty was execution. But before his execution, after his conviction, and before his execution, a fair amount of time elapsed, more than normal. And the reason is that the ship of Theseus every year makes a voyage as part of a kind of ritual. And during the time it's away from Athens, no executions are carried out. And of course, the return time is dependent on weather. And it looks like there was a weather delay. There's no real explanation of it, but it looks like must have been a weather delay, and that Socrates spent more time than normal waiting for his execution. And the Phaedo itself, his friends see or hear that the ship is close, and so they know that this will be Socrates' last day, and so they rush to the prison to have a conversation with him. Now, the ship was thought to be old, even in Socrates' day, thought to be repaired throughout the years many times. And if we ask ourselves, what makes the repaired ship the same as the original ship, the material from which the ship is built doesn't seem to be the answer, right? Because the ship continues, but some of the material, and conceivably all of it over time, does not. Instead, what looks like what we need for the continuing of the ship itself is the original organization, right? So when the ship came into existence, what happened is the materials from which it was built became organized in a certain way. And once that happened, we had the ship of Theseus. And it looks like the ship of Theseus continues as long as that original organization continues. And Aristotle has this kind of view about natural substances, right? He thinks that that what the nature is, so that it acts as a starting point of change and staying unchanged is the organization of the material. And he thinks that this organization, this is what he thinks a form is, right? So in his explanation of the existence of natural bodies, he thinks that they have forms. The forms are the organization of the material so that there is something that behaves like members of the kind behave, and that these forms, these organizations, are in matter and separate in account. And we can see what he has in mind there by thinking about the ship again, right? So if he says that the form is in matter. What he means by that is you can't pull it out. If you try to remove the organization from the pieces of wood and other materials from which the ship is built, what you end up doing by removing that organization is destroying the ship. And what you have left over is a pile of materials. And so the form in this way, on the analogy with the ship, is in matter, and it can't exist apart from matter, except, Aristotle wants to say, in account. And what he means by that, it's a little harder to see, but the rough idea is that we can say what the form is, what the organization is. In the particular case of the ship of Theseus, the ship was a galley, and galleys were a certain kind of ship, and so they functioned in a certain way. We can describe that. We can say what the organization is so that the materials are a galley. And when we do this, Aristotle thinks we don't have to mention any particular piece of material from which the ship is built. And so we can state the account without mentioning any matter. And this is why he describes the form as separate in account. Now, so that's how he understands his forms of natural bodies. And when we look back at the Timaeus, we see that we get a different picture than the one Plato makes Timaeus articulate. In the Timaeus, what happens is we have the divine craftsman, the demiurgos, constructing the cosmos by using a thing that's described as the form of a living creature as the model, and then constructing the cosmos so that it is a living creature. Now, this is a little strange by us standards. We don't tend to think that the universe is alive, or at least it's not a standard view nowadays. But Timaeus thinks that's true, and he thinks that it came to exist. It didn't always exist. It came to exist because the divine craftsman constructed it by looking to a form. And this form he looks to contains the forms of other living creatures. And so what the divine craftsman does, according to the Timaeus, is that he constructs what's described as the heavenly race of gods. These are things that beings that come into existence but then don't go out of existence. They last forever. And Timaeus identifies them with, among other things, the celestial bodies, the fixed and wandering stars. And then the craftsman, he tasks these gods that he made to construct the rest of the living creatures that aren't going to be able to exist like the gods do. They're both come into and go out of existence. They're subject to death. And so that's the picture of how all these things come into existence. And so here you can see that the forms, they exist apart and prior to the living creatures. And Aristotle, he doesn't accept that picture. For him, the forms are not apart, not prior. For each natural body has its own form. That's distinct, numerically distinct from the forms of other natural bodies. But for natural bodies of a given kind, they're identical in account. And he tells us this here in the metaphysics passage. And so what we have is an instance of Aristotle being Platonist and Plato's critic in his explanation of what natural bodies are.